Hi, I'm Anika, 28, and I grew up helping run my family's company. My father, the man I trusted most, made a decision that shook me to my core. He gave my younger brother the CEO position instead of me, just because I'm a woman. I felt invisible in my own family, like all my hard work never mattered. Have you ever been underestimated by someone close? Tell me where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama, emotional courage, and standing up for yourself. The day my father handed the CEO role to my younger brother is etched in my memory like a photograph I can't unsee. I remember standing in the corner of the office conference room, holding a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching him smile at everyone with that proud, satisfied look he always reserved for my brother. I felt a hollow ache inside, like my chest had been quietly hollowed out while everyone else applauded. I'm Anika, 28. And for as long as I can remember, I've been immersed in this company. I practically grew up in the back office, learning spreadsheets, client management, and the finer details of business operations while my father lectured on leadership. I thought I had proven myself countless times, staying late to close deals, designing workflow improvements, and even calming furious clients when things went wrong. Yet here I was, invisible. It wasn't the first time I'd felt overlooked, but this moment was different. My father didn't just pass me over. He deliberately chose my younger brother, who had spent far less time in the business and had far less experience. The betrayal wasn't subtle. It was public, deliberate, and crushing. I remember how the room smelled. A mix of polished wood, coffee, and the faint tang of leather chairs. My father's voice carried across the room, warm and proud, as he explained my brother's qualifications. Each word was like a pinprick. I could hear nods of agreement from the board members, but none of their eyes looked at me. It felt as if I were a ghost in a room full of celebration. After the announcement, I retreated to my office. I shut the door and sank into my chair, letting the silence envelope me. I couldn't cry, I couldn't scream. I just sat there, feeling the weight of every hour I'd spent building the company in the shadows, and the realization that my father saw me as less than because of my gender. It wasn't just professional disappointment, it was personal. I had always believed my father valued merit. I had assumed that hard work, intelligence, and loyalty were enough to earn respect in his eyes. But that assumption had been a fragile illusion. The moment I understood the truth, I felt a strange mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. I remembered earlier that morning, when I had brought my father the monthly revenue report. I had stayed up until 2 a.m. perfecting it, making sure every number was accurate and every forecast realistic. He had glanced at it and said, "Good work, Anika. Keep it up." No hint of praise, no acknowledgement of the effort, just a passing comment. Now I understood. The acknowledgement I craved would never come, no matter how hard I worked. I walked down the hallway of the office slowly, my fingers brushing the smooth glass of the windows, the cool metal of the door handles grounding me in reality. Every step felt heavier than the last. I could hear laughter and chatter from the conference room where the announcement celebration continued. My stomach churned and I realized I was on the outside of a world I had helped build. Later, I overheard a conversation in the lobby that cemented the sting. Two board members were talking quietly about my father's decision. One said, "She's talented, but I guess it's just not traditional to have a woman lead a family business." My blood ran cold. Not just overlooked but dismissed because of my gender. I felt a flush of heat in my cheeks, a cocktail of embarrassment, hurt, and simmering fury. I wandered into the small kitchen adjacent to the office, trying to collect myself. I poured a glass of water and stared out the window, watching a car pull into the parking lot. I remembered all the nights I had stayed behind while my brother went out with friends or took weekend trips. The sacrifices I had made, the effort I had poured into learning the company inside and out, and it had all been invisible. A thought struck me then, sharp and insistent. If he doesn't see my value, I'll have to show it myself. But at that moment I wasn't ready to act. I wasn't ready to fight, not yet. I just sat there trying to breathe past the anger and the hurt, trying to figure out how to exist in a space where my worth was denied. I thought about my brother, who was oblivious to the storm inside me. He was smiling, shaking hands, and accepting congratulations, completely unaware that his promotion was built on a decision that invalidated my years of dedication. I hated that he was unaware. It felt like he was living in the sunlight while I was trapped in shadow. By mid-afternoon, I had retreated to the company library, a quiet room lined with books on leadership, finance, and management. I picked up a book I had read countless times, pretending to focus, but my mind was elsewhere. I ran through every meeting, every late night, every pitch I had delivered. The injustice of it all made my chest tighten. I thought about confronting my father. I imagined walking into his office, telling him exactly how I felt. But I didn't. I wasn't ready to spill my pain into words that might be dismissed or belittled. Instead, I let the realization sink in quietly, methodically. I needed time, patience, and clarity before I could face him, and more importantly, before I could prove him wrong. That evening, I drove home in silence. The roads were empty, the air crisp with early spring chill. I thought about my childhood, about how I had grown up watching my father work tirelessly to build this company. I had idolized him, wanted to emulate him, and now I understood that admiration was complicated by disappointment and betrayal. I entered my apartment and sat at my small kitchen table, staring at a blank notebook. I had always loved writing, using it to organize my thoughts, to plan, to dream. That night I began jotting down everything. My feelings, my anger, my observations about the company, and ideas that had been simmering in my mind for years. It was the first time I consciously transformed my pain into purpose. As the night wore on, I realized something crucial. Being overlooked didn't diminish my capabilities. It didn't erase my knowledge, my dedication, or my potential. What it did was ignite a quiet, steady fire inside me. A fire that would demand recognition, not from my father but from the world. Sleep eventually came, fitful and restless, filled with dreams of meetings, conference rooms, and moments where my efforts would finally be acknowledged. I woke the next morning with a sense of resolve. The day I realized I was overlooked had not broken me. It had defined a boundary I was determined to cross, not for revenge yet, but for my own validation and sense of purpose. Over the next few days, subtle incidents reminded me constantly of my exclusion. In meetings, I noticed my suggestions being dismissed, only for my brother to repeat them and be praised. Clients would compliment my work, but the recognition went to him. Even casual conversations with longtime employees revealed a tacit understanding that he now held the power position. Each moment was a sting, yet each moment reinforced my determination. I began to observe my father more critically, noting the way he unconsciously favored male voices, the assumptions he made about risk and leadership, and the small gestures that betrayed a bias I had never fully confronted before. I didn't yet have a plan to challenge it openly, but understanding it was the first step. By the end of that first week, I had resolved to channel my frustration into action. I wouldn't plead for recognition. I wouldn't rely on approval that had never been forthcoming. I would find a way to prove my worth on my own terms, in ways that couldn't be ignored, dismissed, or attributed to luck. That night I sat at my desk, notebook open, pen in hand, heart pounding with a mixture of anger, grief, and determination. The moment I realized I was overlooked was no longer just a memory of betrayal. It had become the starting point of something bigger, something I hadn't yet fully imagined but could already feel taking shape. And that was when I decided I would show my father and everyone else exactly what they had underestimated. The first morning after that long night of reflection, I sat at my small kitchen table with my notebook open, the faint aroma of brewed coffee filling the room. The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside became the background to my thoughts, a comforting white noise as I considered the first steps of what would become my secret venture. I had no fancy office, no investors lined up, and certainly no one in my family ready to back me. But I had ideas, determination, and a sense of purpose that had been ignited by the betrayal I had just endured. I started with a simple sketch. On a crumpled sheet of paper, I wrote down all the problems I had noticed in the company over the years, the small gaps and overlooked opportunities. Some were inefficiencies I had suggested fixing countless times, ignored by both my father and my brother. Others were untapped niches in the market that no one else had pursued. As I scribbled, the possibilities began to expand before me, each one a tiny spark of potential, and I felt the first thrill of creation after weeks of despair. The first challenge came almost immediately: money. I had some savings, modest as they were, but it wasn't nearly enough to start a legitimate business. I went through every personal account, every small certificate of deposit, and even the little fund I had set aside for emergencies. I told myself that every penny invested here would be for a purpose, a seed that could grow into something undeniable. I felt the familiar pang of fear, the question of whether I was risking too much. But every time doubt crept in, I thought of my father's smirk as he handed the roll to my brother, and the fear diminished just enough to move forward. I needed a workspace. My tiny apartment wasn't ideal, but it had a corner in the living room where I could set up a small desk and my laptop. I pushed aside my personal clutter, creating a little office nook that would be mine alone. I hung a whiteboard on the wall and began jotting down ideas, diagrams, and deadlines. Each line, each scribble felt like I was reclaiming something I had been denied. A piece of control over my own life. Research became my first priority. I spent hours digging through industry reports, competitor websites, and market analyses. I read customer reviews, noting recurring complaints that I could address. I tracked trends, studied pricing models, and even created mock proposals for imaginary clients. The work was exhausting, but every small insight felt like a secret advantage. No one else knew I was doing this. Not my father, not my brother, not even my closest friends. It was mine, entirely mine, and that secrecy added a pulse of excitement to each day. One evening, as I sat hunched over my laptop, my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. Excited to start as CEO today. Wish you were here, Anika. I stared at the message for a long moment, a mixture of frustration and something else, amusement washing over me. I typed a brief reply. Good luck. Hope it goes well. Then I closed my phone, focusing back on my plans. I realized that while he basked in recognition he hadn't earned, I had the freedom to quietly build something lasting, without anyone watching or expecting anything. Finding suppliers was harder than I had anticipated. Every company I contacted required references, minimum order quantities, or a track record I didn't yet have. I learned quickly how to negotiate politely yet firmly, presenting myself as a serious, capable business owner despite my lack of formal backing. I discovered a small supplier willing to provide a limited run of my first product, under a very flexible agreement. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to get started. Every evening I worked late into the night. My apartment lights glowed in the otherwise dark street, a small beacon of determination. I would measure prototypes, make calculations, and send emails, often while snacking on whatever I could grab from the kitchen. The process was slow, tedious, and sometimes discouraging, but every step brought a sense of ownership I had never felt in my father's company. Here my ideas were heard, at least by me, and I could see the tangible results of my effort. The first small victory came unexpectedly. I pitched my concept to a local business mentor I had met briefly at a networking event months earlier. I had been hesitant to reach out, fearing rejection or embarrassment, but I explained my vision clearly, emphasizing the uniqueness of the solution I was developing. He listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and then, to my surprise, offered to introduce me to a potential client. My heart raced with a mix of disbelief and excitement. It was a validation that I hadn't received from my father, and it fueled my determination to keep going. I also faced the emotional struggle of keeping this venture secret from my family. My father's casual comments about leadership and my brother's boasting about meetings were constant reminders of the world I was quietly building outside of their notice. Some days I wanted to burst out and confront them, to declare my work and prove my competence immediately. But I forced myself to wait. Secrecy, I realized, was my ally. Revealing my venture too soon could undermine its potential and rob me of the satisfaction of seeing it succeed independently. I began tracking every detail meticulously. Emails were logged, schedules organized, contacts categorized, and progress measured in spreadsheets. I even set small goals for myself. Reaching a certain number of prototypes, obtaining a specific client, or mastering a technical skill related to production. Each tiny milestone felt like a victory, a counterpoint to the rejection I had faced. It reminded me that progress was possible even without recognition, and that tangible results were far more meaningful than hollow praise. Along the way, I encountered setbacks that tested my resolve. A shipment was delayed due to weather, a client questioned the quality of a prototype, and one of my early ideas had to be scrapped entirely. Each challenge forced me to adapt, think creatively, and develop resilience I hadn't realized I possessed. By solving problems quietly and effectively, I was learning lessons my father's office could never teach: resourcefulness, patience, and the value of persistence. Late nights were often punctuated by moments of self-doubt. I would stare at the ceiling, wondering if I was chasing an impossible dream, imagining the embarrassment of failure if anyone discovered my secret before it succeeded. Yet, every time that doubt arose, I thought back to the sting of being overlooked. That memory became fuel, pushing me forward with a mix of quiet anger and ambition. It was no longer about proving him wrong in a confrontational way. It was about proving my own worth, and nothing could be more satisfying than success earned on my own terms. Slowly, the small venture began to take shape. I developed a prototype, tested it with a handful of potential clients, and received positive feedback that boosted my confidence. Each small success reinforced the belief that I was capable, that my ideas were valid, and that my gender did not define my potential. In fact, the challenges I faced as a woman working independently had taught me skills and perspectives that my brother could never have developed in his inherited role. I started building a team, carefully selecting individuals who shared my vision and were willing to take a leap of faith with me. Many were younger professionals or freelancers who had struggled to find opportunities in traditional offices. Working with them, I discovered a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose that felt entirely new. We celebrated small achievements quietly: first positive feedback from a client, first functional prototype, first successful delivery. Each moment strengthened our collective commitment and deepened my own sense of capability. Marketing became a new challenge. I had no budget for ads or flashy campaigns, so I relied on word of mouth, small networking events, and social media outreach. I crafted messages carefully, highlighting the unique aspects of our product and our attention to quality. Slowly, inquiries began to trickle in, first one, then a handful, then enough to consider the venture officially launched. Every response was a small victory, a silent acknowledgement of the vision I had nurtured in secrecy. I also learned to compartmentalize my life carefully. By day, I continued to perform my duties at my father's company, taking meetings, assisting with projects, and maintaining appearances. By night, I transformed into the founder of my own venture, drafting emails, negotiating with suppliers, and refining our product. The duality was exhausting, but it taught me discipline, focus, and the ability to function under pressure, skills I had long observed in my father but never fully appreciated until I had to practice them independently. Through it all, I kept a journal, not just to plan but to process my emotions. I wrote about the sting of exclusion, the frustrations of setbacks, the moments of quiet triumph, and the small, almost imperceptible satisfaction of building something purely on my own terms. The journal became a mirror, reflecting not just the venture's progress, but my own transformation. I could see myself growing stronger, more confident, more determined than ever. By the end of several weeks, the venture was no longer just an idea. It was a living, breathing project with prototypes, clients, a dedicated team, and a growing reputation. The excitement was palpable, a quiet, persistent hum that fueled every action. And yet, the work remained secret, the venture hidden from those who had doubted me most. It was my proof, my silent answer to the dismissal I had endured. As I closed my laptop that night, exhausted but exhilarated, I realized something profound. I was no longer defined by the rejection I had faced. I had planted the seeds of something real, something tangible, and it was growing in ways that even my father could not control or diminish. I felt a sense of liberation, a quiet joy in knowing that my work, my vision, and my perseverance would ultimately speak louder than any denial or oversight. The journey was only beginning. There were challenges ahead, undoubtedly more obstacles, setbacks, and surprises. But for the first time, I felt the exhilarating sense that I was creating my own path, entirely on my own terms. And in that realization, a spark ignited. A spark that would guide every decision, every late night, and every risk in the days to come. By the time the third week rolled around, my secret venture had started to feel like more than a late-night project. It was no longer just sketches and ideas on paper. It was a living, breathing entity that responded to my efforts and demanded my attention. The first real sign that my work was gaining traction came from a simple email, a response from a local boutique that had expressed interest in testing my product. I remember staring at the message for what felt like an eternity, my fingers frozen above the keyboard. The words on the screen seemed almost unreal. We'd like to place a small initial order. Can we schedule a call? My heart raced. This wasn't just validation. It was proof that my ideas had value outside my own head. I read the email over and over, each time feeling a growing sense of exhilaration. I responded carefully, setting up a call for the next morning. That night I barely slept, thinking through every question they might ask, every objection I might face. I wanted to be ready, to show competence and professionalism, even as I operated in the shadows of my father's empire. The call itself was a whirlwind of nerves and excitement. The boutique owner's voice was warm, but precise, peppered with practical questions about delivery, product quality, and consistency. I answered each one honestly, highlighting the small advantages of my approach without overselling. By the end of the call, they had committed to a trial order. I hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence for several minutes, letting the reality sink in. My venture, my creation, had just earned its first client. That small victory sparked a series of other breakthroughs. I reached out to a handful of independent retailers I had researched earlier, sending carefully tailored emails that reflected the unique value of my products. Slowly, responses trickled in, some positive, some cautious, but every acknowledgement felt like a tiny triumph. Each order, no matter how modest, carried weight. It wasn't about the money. It was about recognition that my ideas could stand on their own. I also began experimenting with marketing in subtle, low-cost ways. Social media became a secret tool for testing interest and building visibility, without revealing my connection to the family company. I created small, targeted posts and observed reactions, likes, comments, and inquiries that felt both thrilling and validating. There was a certain quiet satisfaction in seeing people respond to my work without knowing whose daughter I was. For the first time, my abilities were judged purely on merit, not on my family name or lack thereof. The first in-person meeting with a client was another pivotal moment. I carried a small sample of my product in a nondescript bag, stepping into a modest office space and presenting my concept with a mix of nervousness and confidence. Watching their expressions as they examined the prototype and nodded appreciatively was intoxicating. They asked questions I had anticipated, and I answered each with care, drawing from the weeks of research and preparation I had done in private. When the meeting concluded with a handshake and the promise of a purchase order, I felt an emotional release so profound that I wanted to laugh and cry simultaneously. But not every moment was triumphant. One of the first retailers I had contacted suddenly pulled out after citing budget concerns. I remember sitting on the floor of my apartment, staring at the ceiling, feeling the sting of rejection. I had worked so hard, meticulously planned every detail, and yet one phone call could unravel my progress. The frustration was sharp, but it also forced me to adapt. I brainstormed alternative approaches, reached out to backup contacts, and found another client willing to step in. Each setback became a lesson, a chance to refine my methods and strengthen my resilience. Working with my small team also brought unexpected joys and challenges. I had recruited 2 freelancers, one a young designer named Mia, and the other a recent marketing graduate, Luis. Mia had an eye for detail that complemented my strategic thinking, while Luis brought creativity and energy to the venture. Our late-night virtual sessions were filled with brainstorming, debates, and occasional laughter. There was a camaraderie I hadn't realized I craved, and I found myself energizing them as much as they inspired me. Together, we celebrated every small success. The first successful prototype test, a positive client email, or even a social media mention. Each was a hidden triumph, quietly powerful, building a foundation for what I hoped would become something enduring. I also started to notice subtle changes in myself. Confidence grew in ways I hadn't anticipated. I spoke more assertively on calls, negotiated with suppliers without hesitation, and made decisions with a clarity that had once seemed impossible. These weren't loud victories, they were internal, quiet transformations, but they mattered as much as any order or client approval. Each day, I felt myself stepping further into a version of myself that my father had never recognized, one capable of creating, leading, and persevering without external validation. One evening, I faced a particularly stressful situation. A shipment was delayed due to a logistics issue, threatening to miss a critical client deadline. My stomach churned as I scrambled to find a solution. I contacted alternative couriers, adjusted timelines, and negotiated directly with the client to manage expectations. By the end of the day, the problem was resolved with minimal impact. Sitting back in my chair, exhausted and relieved, I realized something important. Every obstacle I navigated quietly strengthened the venture, and me. These small, often invisible victories were building my confidence and credibility, even if no one else yet knew about them. Another hidden triumph came from the feedback I received from early clients. One email in particular stood out. A local boutique owner wrote, "Anika, I can't tell you how impressed I am with your attention to detail and dedication. You clearly care about quality and it shows. I've already recommended you to a colleague." I stared at the message for several minutes, the words sinking into me. For once, the recognition felt real and untainted by family ties or bias. It was earned, and that made it infinitely more satisfying than any praise I had ever hoped to receive from my father. I also faced moments of moral complexity. I occasionally ran into situations where my father's company had inadvertently overlooked clients or made mistakes. I had the opportunity to subtly reach out and offer solutions, without revealing that I was the one behind the new venture. The satisfaction of quietly correcting errors that he had ignored was bittersweet. It wasn't revenge in a dramatic sense, but it carried a quiet power, a proof that competence could exist independently of favoritism. As the weeks passed, the venture continued to grow in small, meaningful ways. I secured a second client, improved product prototypes, and developed a modest social media presence. Each milestone was small in comparison to my father's empire, but it was mine entirely, and that made it feel monumental. I began mapping out the next steps, thinking strategically about scaling, logistics, and partnerships. The planning itself became an enjoyable challenge, a test of creativity and foresight. Financial management became another layer of learning. I carefully tracked expenses, revenue, and projections, learning lessons in budgeting, risk management, and prioritization. Every decision required careful consideration because every dollar mattered. Mistakes were costly, but they were also invaluable learning experiences, teaching me lessons about resourcefulness and the importance of planning. The discipline required to maintain control over finances and operations was intense, but it strengthened my resolve and my confidence in my own abilities. Even the smallest interactions brought joy. A phone call from a client complimenting a new design. A message from Mia about a small tweak that improved efficiency. An email from Luis with creative suggestions for packaging. These moments, seemingly minor, reinforced the sense of accomplishment and connection that had been missing from my professional life. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in a world where merit and effort mattered above legacy or gender. I also began to experiment with small innovations, testing different product variations, packaging options, and marketing strategies. Each test offered new insights, some successful, others less so, but all valuable. I realized that growth often came from a series of small, calculated experiments rather than one dramatic breakthrough. This approach suited me perfectly, emphasizing patience, persistence, and the quiet satisfaction of incremental progress. Despite the progress, I was constantly aware of the secrecy that framed every action. Every time I received a positive email or secured a new client, a part of me wanted to share the victory, to show my father that I was capable. But the real power lay in restraint. Each triumph, hidden from those who had doubted me, was a silent affirmation that I could succeed without permission or approval. That realization became its own kind of triumph, a private, potent satisfaction that fueled my next steps. By the end of the third month, the venture had transformed from a collection of ideas into a functioning enterprise. I had a growing client base, a small but dedicated team, and a workflow that was efficient and sustainable. Each day brought challenges, but also small wins that reminded me why I had started this journey. The hidden triumphs, accumulated quietly and steadily, were more powerful than any public recognition I had ever received. I remember sitting one night reviewing all the progress I had made. The apartment was silent, the city lights twinkling through the window. I reflected on the journey, the early setbacks, the moments of self-doubt, the long nights of research and preparation, and I felt a profound sense of pride. Not pride in defiance or revenge, but pride in creation, resilience, and the quiet, undeniable evidence of my own capability. In that moment, I realized the truth I had been searching for. Recognition from others, even my father, was not necessary for my validation. Each small win, each hidden triumph, was a testament to my perseverance, intelligence, and determination. I was building something of value entirely on my own terms, and as I closed my laptop that night, exhausted but exhilarated, I felt a quiet but powerful satisfaction. I was no longer just someone overlooked. I was a creator, a problem solver, and a quietly unstoppable force. The venture, still hidden from those who had doubted me, was proof that competence and determination could thrive independently of expectation or approval. By the time the venture had quietly gained momentum, I realized that what I had built in secret was no longer just a fledgling operation. It was a force that, if unleashed at the right moment, could make my father and everyone in his orbit see what they had underestimated for years. But before any revelation could happen, I had to climb. A climb not measured in office hierarchies or inherited titles, but in credibility, influence, and undeniable results that would stand independently of his empire. I began the climb with focus and discipline. Each day, I treated the venture as though it were a mountain to scale. I mapped out every milestone, every target, every potential obstacle that might threaten my progress. My team, small but loyal, followed my lead with quiet determination. Mia and Luis became more than collaborators. They were co-conspirators in this ascent, each aware of the stakes and committed to building something that could one day challenge the assumptions of my family. The first major hurdle came with a potential contract from a regional distributor. Securing it would mean scaling production beyond what I had previously attempted, testing both my resources and my resolve. I spent late nights calculating costs, renegotiating terms with suppliers, and developing contingency plans in case anything went wrong. My apartment became a war room, cluttered with samples, spreadsheets, and sticky notes that outlined every detail of the operation. Each calculation, each phone call, and each email was a small step upward, a push against the gravity of doubt and the weight of being overlooked. One evening, as I was reviewing an order schedule, the phone rang. It was the distributor's representative. My pulse raced as I answered, trying to mask both excitement and nerves. The conversation was tense. They raised concerns about delivery timelines, consistency of product quality, and previous client references. I listened carefully, taking mental notes, then responded calmly, outlining adjustments we could make to meet their standards. By the end of the call, they had agreed to a trial order. My heart pounded, but I allowed myself only a brief moment of celebration. The climb was far from over. The next challenge was internal, my own self-doubt. There were moments when I questioned whether I could truly maintain this momentum. Could I balance my day job at my father's company with the relentless demands of building a venture that could one day stand alongside his empire? I often found myself pacing my apartment at midnight, reviewing plans, imagining worst-case scenarios, and wondering if the stress might be too much. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the reasons I had started. Not revenge, but proof of capability, determination, and vision. As weeks turned into months, the climb gained visible traction. I started receiving more inquiries from clients, some of whom had discovered my venture through word of mouth or social media posts. Each inquiry felt like another foothold on the mountain, another proof that the work I had poured myself into could not be ignored. I began taking measured risks, launching small pilot programs, experimenting with slightly higher production volumes, and expanding the team to handle growing demand. Each step upward required careful calculation, but the rewards were immediate and tangible. One particularly memorable moment came when a client requested a customized product variation that required sourcing a rare material. The initial quote was daunting, but I knew the payoff could be significant. I spent days negotiating with suppliers, arranging logistics, and testing prototypes. When the final product was delivered successfully, the client's excitement and repeated orders were confirmation that calculated risks could yield profound rewards. It was a moment of triumph I allowed myself to savor quietly, knowing it was a step closer to challenging the assumptions of my father's empire. As the venture grew, so did my confidence in navigating high-pressure situations. I had learned to maintain composure when clients were frustrated, deadlines were tight, or shipments were delayed. Each successful resolution added not just credibility to the venture, but also an internal sense of mastery. I had never experienced working under my father's shadow. The climb was teaching me resilience, strategic thinking, and the kind of leadership that demanded both patience and assertiveness. Meanwhile, the small victories began to accumulate in a way that was visible even to those who might have dismissed me initially. I had a few clients who became repeat customers, generating steady revenue streams. I started attending regional trade events and networking gatherings, always representing my venture professionally and confidently. Observing the responses of potential partners and clients, I noticed a subtle shift. People listened to me, respected my insights, and sometimes even deferred to my judgment. It was a quiet, gradual affirmation that my climb was not in vain. Of course, not every step was smooth. I encountered obstacles that tested my adaptability. A shipment was lost due to a supplier error. A small design flaw caused a client to hesitate, and one of my team members faced personal challenges that temporarily slowed progress. Each incident was a reminder that the climb required constant vigilance and flexibility. I learned to anticipate issues, develop backup plans, and address problems proactively, strengthening both my venture and my own ability to lead under pressure. One night, I received a particularly challenging email from a longtime client who expressed dissatisfaction with a recent delivery. My stomach twisted as I read the message, fearing the consequences of failure. I immediately called the client, listened carefully to their concerns, and proposed a solution that included expedited replacement shipments and a small bonus as an apology for inconvenience. By the end of the call, the client was satisfied, appreciative, and even more loyal than before. It was a small triumph, a hidden victory that reinforced the importance of careful attention, empathy, and decisive action in climbing the ladder of success. Amidst the business challenges, personal growth was equally pronounced. I became more disciplined with time management, balancing early morning research, daytime client communications, and late-night production oversight. I developed a sharper intuition for negotiation and a stronger sense of strategic foresight. These skills, while cultivated quietly and away from my father's recognition, were empowering. I realized that leadership was not about titles. It was about results, consistency, and the ability to inspire others, even in secrecy. A turning point came when I secured a partnership with a small but reputable regional distributor. The negotiations were intense. They scrutinized every aspect of my venture, from logistics to quality control to projected growth. I held my ground, presenting data, answering questions, and articulating my vision with confidence. By the time the agreement was signed, I felt a sense of legitimacy and accomplishment that no one in my family had yet acknowledged. It was a tangible sign that my climb was not just symbolic, it had real-world consequences. The climb was not without its emotional complexities. Watching my brother continue in his inherited role, occasionally boasting about minor achievements, tested my patience. There were moments when I felt a pang of envy, a whisper of frustration that he had received recognition without effort while I had to fight in silence. But each of these moments also reinforced my resolve. My ascent was deliberate, grounded in merit, and insulated from favoritism. The higher I climbed, the more I realized that silent persistence could be far more powerful than immediate confrontation. Another subtle but important victory came from the efficiency improvements I introduced within the venture. I streamlined production processes, optimized supplier relationships, and implemented tracking systems that ensured consistency and reliability. These changes, while behind the scenes, significantly enhanced our capability and reputation. The climb was becoming exponential. Each improvement enabled another step upward, reinforcing momentum and increasing my leverage for the eventual revelation. Team cohesion became another critical aspect of the ascent. Mia and Luis were not just colleagues. They were allies in a journey that required trust, commitment, and shared vision. I held regular check-ins, celebrated small achievements, and addressed challenges collaboratively. The shared triumphs strengthened loyalty and morale, creating a resilient foundation for the venture. It became clear to me that leadership was not just about direction, but about cultivating a team capable of sustaining and growing the vision. By the end of several months, the venture had reached a stage where its growth was undeniable. Revenue had increased, clients were multiplying, and operational systems were robust. The climb, once daunting and filled with uncertainty, had produced results that could no longer be dismissed as luck or coincidence. I could feel a shift within myself as well. The quiet pride of accomplishment, the satisfaction of competence earned through effort, and the exhilaration of seeing a vision realized against the odds. The climb also revealed personal insights. I discovered an inner reservoir of strength I hadn't fully recognized, the ability to remain focused under pressure, and the capacity to navigate setbacks without losing momentum. I learned to celebrate small victories quietly, to appreciate incremental progress, and to derive fulfillment from the mastery of my craft rather than external recognition. Each step upward reinforced the truth that success was earned, not inherited. Late one night, after finalizing an important client order, I sat in my apartment staring at the city lights. The glow outside mirrored the glow within me. The sense that I had climbed higher than I had thought possible, that every effort, every sleepless night, and every small victory had accumulated into something formidable. I felt a deep satisfaction knowing that my journey, though quiet and unseen, was shaking the foundations of assumptions I had once taken for granted. And in that moment I understood that the climb had changed everything, not just for the venture but for me. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a creator, a strategist, a leader, and a force capable of challenging expectations, quietly and powerfully. My ascent was still unfolding, but each step had proven one undeniable fact. Merit, persistence, and vision could shake even the most established empire. The day I had been quietly preparing for finally arrived, though I didn't rush toward it recklessly. I had reached a point where the venture could no longer be hidden. It had momentum, clients, revenue, and a credibility that even my father could not ignore. Sitting at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee, I stared at my phone and considered my next steps. Part of me wanted to confront him with emotion, a sharp demand for acknowledgement. But a larger, wiser part reminded me that my ultimate power lay in restraint, the ability to reveal my achievements on my terms. I called my father, keeping my tone casual, careful not to betray the tension simmering beneath my words. "Dad, I'd like to meet you at the office tomorrow," I said, letting the words hang just long enough to pique curiosity. He sounded mildly surprised, the kind of casual curiosity only a man who had long underestimated his daughter could muster. "Sure, Anika. What's this about?" he asked, his voice tinged with faint amusement. That amused tone fueled me more than it discouraged me. He was about to realize that the joke was no longer on me. The next morning, I arrived at the family office not as the overlooked daughter, but as the founder and operator of a venture that had quietly outpaced expectations. I wore a suit that was professional but understated, my posture confident, and my expression composed. My father rose from his chair, an almost imperceptible frown forming as he noticed the energy I carried. He didn't yet know the scale of what I had accomplished, but he could sense it. I started with a simple gesture. I laid a folder on the desk, filled with organized reports, client lists, revenue charts, and product photos. "Dad," I said calmly, "this is what I've been working on for the past several months." I didn't raise my voice, I didn't demand applause. I simply let the evidence speak. I watched as his eyes scanned the pages, the frown deepening, a flash of disbelief crossing his face. He paused, adjusting his glasses as if trying to understand how I had achieved all of this without his guidance, without the family company's resources. This is yours?" he asked, his tone a mix of astonishment and incredulity. I nodded. "Yes, entirely mine. I built it from scratch, suppliers, clients, logistics, the whole operation. You and the company didn't see potential in me, so I proved it on my own." For the first time in years, I saw him at a loss for words, a rare vulnerability that I had longed to witness. It wasn't arrogance, it was quiet validation, the satisfaction of letting achievement speak louder than argument. My brother wandered in halfway through the presentation, curious about the hushed voices from my father's office. When he saw the reports, his initial smirk faltered. "Wait, this is all yours?" he asked, incredulity etched into his features. I met his gaze evenly. "Yes. While you were busy being appointed CEO because of your gender, I built something that's real, profitable, and respected by clients. No inherited title required." I could see the weight of realization hit him. He was accustomed to automatic validation, and this quiet storm of competence disrupted everything he had taken for granted. The conversation with my father escalated in tension, though I kept my tone steady. He asked how I had managed the logistics, the clients, the marketing, even the financial tracking. I explained without embellishment the countless hours, the research, the negotiations, and the problem-solving I had done. Each explanation was another layer of proof, not just of the venture's success, but of my capability to lead, innovate, and handle pressure with poise. My father's expression shifted from disbelief to grudging respect, and I felt a quiet victory settle in my chest. "What I don't understand," he said finally, "is why you didn't just come to me earlier. Why keep it all secret?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Because, Dad, I needed to build it without interference, without bias, and without being overlooked. I had to prove that I could do it independently. Not for revenge, but for myself, to show what I'm capable of when given no shortcuts." My father's silence said more than any words could. For the first time, I realized he understood the depth of my determination, even if he couldn't yet fully admit it aloud. The recognition didn't come as a dramatic apology, nor did my father suddenly shower me with praise. Instead, it was subtle. An acknowledgement in his eyes, a nod to my competence, and the realization that the empire he had built was no longer the only measure of success in the family. For the first time, I felt that I existed not in the shadow of his expectations, but as an autonomous force, capable of shaping my own path. One of the more satisfying moments came when I discussed potential partnerships. My father had been negotiating a deal with a regional client, unaware that my venture had already engaged them with success. I presented the results, showing not only the revenue generated but also client satisfaction, operational efficiency, and potential for future growth. The look on his face was a mixture of pride and shock. It was as if the empire he had assumed was untouchable had been quietly challenged, and the challenger had been right under his nose the entire time. Even my brother, who had benefited from easy recognition, had to reconsider his assumptions. I watched as he absorbed the facts, his posture stiff, his usual arrogance replaced by a cautious respect. I didn't gloat. I let the evidence speak. His realization was enough. I didn't need to verbally assert superiority. The numbers, the operations, and the client feedback were undeniable. Small victories like this, though subtle, carried a weight that confrontation alone could never achieve. Independence became my most cherished reward. I realized that the venture was no longer just a counterpoint to the family business. It was my creation, and it existed on its own merits. I could operate freely, make decisions without oversight, and pursue growth without interference. The freedom to chart my own course was more empowering than any public recognition or familial approval. Every challenge I had faced, every hidden triumph had led me here. Not only to prove my worth but to establish a life where I was accountable only to my vision and my team. Yet, the confrontation and recognition were not limited to formal meetings. Subtle moments reinforced the shift in dynamics. During lunch meetings with clients who were unaware of my family ties, my father occasionally observed the respect I commanded. When he asked questions, I answered with expertise, and he could no longer treat me as the daughter who was overlooked. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the power I had quietly accumulated, a validation that did not require dramatic declarations, just consistent, undeniable performance. As the weeks unfolded, I continued to expand the venture, leveraging both confidence and independence. I scaled operations, improved client experiences, and introduced new products that met market demands I had identified months earlier. Each success further solidified my position, both within the venture and in the eyes of my family. I was no longer the overlooked daughter. I was a founder, a strategist, and a leader whose capabilities could not be ignored. There were moments of tension, of course. My father occasionally questioned my methods, subtly probing for weaknesses, testing whether my independence could hold under scrutiny. Each time I responded with calm clarity, providing data, reasoning, and solutions that reinforced my competence. It became clear to me that true recognition was earned not through confrontation, but through demonstration, through consistent, measurable, and intelligent action. The venture's success also inspired personal growth beyond business acumen. I became more confident in asserting boundaries, more deliberate in decision-making, and more attuned to my own instincts. Independence was not just about financial success. It was about emotional resilience, clarity of purpose, and the knowledge that I could navigate complex situations without relying on external validation. Each day of autonomous operation reinforced that lesson, deepening my sense of empowerment. I recall a pivotal evening when I returned home after presenting a strategic growth plan to a major client. My father called, asking to speak. I could sense the hesitation in his voice, the weight of recognition unspoken. "Anika," he said quietly, "I see what you've built. I underestimated you." His words, simple as they were, carried an immense weight. I didn't respond immediately, allowing the moment to linger. Finally I said, "Thank you, Dad. But this was never about your approval. It was about proving it to myself, and now to the world." That moment crystallized everything I had been working toward. Confrontation had occurred, recognition had been earned, and independence had been established. I didn't need to shout or demand acknowledgement. The results were irrefutable. The venture, my creation, stood as a testament to perseverance, intelligence, and unyielding determination. And most importantly, it belonged to me alone. As I looked back on the months of effort, the long nights, the careful planning, the small victories, and the setbacks, I realized that the journey itself had been as transformative as the outcome. I had grown into a version of myself that no familial bias could suppress, a version capable of handling challenges, creating opportunities, and commanding respect. The confrontation was complete, the recognition quiet but undeniable, and the independence absolute. By the time I left the office that evening, the city lights stretched out below me, and I felt a profound sense of freedom. I had climbed, quietly and deliberately, and had emerged not only victorious in the venture but liberated in spirit. My father and brother could no longer define my worth. I had built it, nurtured it, and proven it on my own. The empire I had quietly challenged had shifted, and the most important empire, the one within myself, was fully mine.